Timothy was known in his circle as the man who gets everything he wants. He owned numerous companies, real estate around the world, and a collection of luxury cars that sparked envy in anyone who saw them. However, his true passion was not money, but gambling. His friends knew that if Timothy got involved in a bet, it was always bound to be a spectacle. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. At a private party attended by the city's most influential people, the topic of marriage came up casually in conversation. No one expected that one of Timothy's friends, Victor, would voice such a bold idea. "Timothy, what if you married not just any model like Beauty, but an ordinary, even chubby girl? Just for a bet?" Everyone laughed, but a spark of interest ignited in Timothy's eyes. "You mean to say I can't?" he said challengingly, as if considering this more of a business deal than a matter of marriage. "Exactly," Victor smirked, "but there's one condition. She has to be not just chubby, but someone you wouldn't even notice on the street. You have to truly marry her, with a beautiful wedding, and you can't abandon her for at least a year." The crowd fell silent for a moment. It was a challenge Timothy couldn't ignore. He knew his friends expected boldness from him, no matter the cost. "A year? Easy." Timothy shrugged, confident it would all just be a game. But no one warned him that this game could turn out to be far more complicated than he anticipated. A few days after the party, Timothy received a dossier on several candidates. One of them caught his attention, Natasha. She was neither a model nor an actress, she was just a regular shop assistant. Since childhood, she had struggled with her weight but had never lost her optimism. The smile in her photos seemed sincere, and her eyes were kind, and that's what made Timothy choose her. Why not, he thought, certain she would never figure out about the bet and that he could easily handle this role. The meeting went unexpectedly well. Timothy, with his charm and charisma, effortlessly struck up a friendship with Natasha. She couldn't believe that such a successful man was paying attention to her. He surrounded her with care, lavished expensive gifts on her, and promised her the happiness she had long waited for. For Natasha, it felt like a dream. She didn't know that all of this was a mere wager. She believed she had found her prince, while Timothy became increasingly involved in his game, testing how far he could go. However, with each passing day spent with Natasha, something began to change within Timothy. He saw her not just as a chubby girl to overlook, but as a person with real emotions, care, and sincerity, qualities he had lacked in his relationships with other women. That began to scare him. He wasn't ready to admit to himself that his game was starting to spiral out of control, especially as the wedding was already planned. The stakes were raised, and there was no turning back. Timothy continued to reassure himself that this was all temporary, that in a year it would all be over, and he would return to his usual life. But deep down, he felt that Natasha was not someone he could just let go of. The wedding approached with incredible speed. Natasha, filled with joy and excitement, was immersed in choosing dresses, flowers, and guests. She couldn't believe her luck. Timothy, rich, successful, and charismatic, turned out to be exactly what she had been searching for her whole life. In her dreams, the wedding symbolized the beginning of a new, magical life. Timothy, for his part, acted as though everything was going according to plan. He knew this was just a bet that he needed to win. But standing beside Natasha in the bridal salon, watching her try on a fluffy white dress, he started to wonder if he should continue this masquerade. Her genuine happiness became something frightening for him. "What do you think?" Natasha turned to him with a smile, her eyes sparkling with excitement. The white lace dress accentuated her curves, and she looked charming. Timothy caught himself thinking that for the first time in a long while, it was hard to lie to her. "You look beautiful," he said with a light smirk, trying to hide his true feelings. But inside him, a contradiction was brewing. He couldn't believe that this woman, chosen for a wager, had become important to him. Tension began to rise within Timothy. On the one hand, he had to win the bet, but on the other, something inside him screamed that it had all gone too far. Meanwhile, rumors about the upcoming wedding began to spread among his acquaintances. Some friends, especially Victor, the one who proposed the bet, eagerly awaited the event. They anticipated the outcome, hoping the wedding would be a farce and that Natasha would do something ridiculous, justifying their preconceived notions. "Aren't you going to actually live with her?" Victor asked a couple of days before the wedding. "You'll ditch her right after the first anniversary. This is all a joke, right?" Timothy remained silent. He wasn't prepared for an answer. In that month, something inside him had changed, but he couldn't pinpoint what exactly. He could no longer perceive Natasha as a mere object of the bet, yet admitting that to himself was equally impossible. Victor continued to laugh, oblivious to how Timothy's expression had shifted. Everyone expected a show from him, but he felt increasingly trapped. The wedding day arrived. The vast hall was decorated with white flowers, and thousands of candles created a romantic atmosphere. Natasha in her white dress looked like a queen. Her eyes sparkled with happiness. Timothy stood at the altar, waiting for his bride, but he was thinking about something entirely different. He kept trying to sort out what he was feeling. This wedding, which should have been just part of the game, had turned into something more. This feeling wouldn't leave him alone, as though he was standing on the edge of a cliff. When Natasha approached the altar, the hall filled with applause. Guests, unable to believe their eyes, watched as Timothy, once known as a playboy and cynic, prepared to marry a girl no one considered suitable for him. The ceremony began. The priest recited words, and the moment came when Timothy was supposed to say the sacred "I do." Natasha looked at him with hope, with such pure love that it took his breath away. But instead of the expected answer, something went awry. The thought crossed Timothy's mind, "What am I doing?" But before he could say anything, Natasha suddenly took the microphone. "Before we continue," her voice was calm yet assured, "I need to say something." The hall fell silent. Timothy felt chills run down his spine. "I know about the bet," Natasha said, and the silence in the hall became oppressive. All the guests froze. Each one seemed to stop breathing, disbelieving what they had just heard. Natasha, in her pristine white dress, stood at the altar with a microphone in hand, and her voice echoed through the room. Timothy felt his heart start racing, and his palms became sweaty. "I know about the bet," Natasha repeated. Her gaze was fixed directly on Timothy. In her eyes, there was no resentment or anger, only calm confidence. Timothy couldn't believe what he was hearing. His meticulously planned scheme was collapsing right before his eyes. How did she find out? Who had he let it slip to? Questions in his mind multiplied, but there were no answers. Natasha continued. Her voice sounded surprisingly firm for such a situation. "I know that it all began as a game, that you, Timothy, agreed to marry me for the bet, and that this year was supposed to be just a test, a joke." She paused, glancing around the hall as if checking the guests' reactions. "But do you know what's most interesting?" Natasha smiled. Her smile was soft, but it held something deeper. Timothy wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He watched as the guests' expressions gradually changed, shock, confusion, and even laughter from some, everything blended into one mixed scene. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some genuinely couldn't believe this was happening before their eyes. Natasha stepped forward and reached out her hand to Timothy, compelling him to look her directly in the eye. "I knew it almost from the very beginning," she said quietly, and her voice no longer filled the hall. "It was a confession only for the two of them, but despite all this," I continued. "Not because I wanted to prove something to you, but because I fell in love with you." Timothy froze. He had never felt so vulnerable. His entire world, built on lies, crumbled in an instant. A thought flickered in his mind that perhaps he had underestimated Natasha all along. He had thought of her as simple and naive, believing she would never guess his intentions. But now, with everything laid bare, Natasha raised the microphone again, addressing the guests. "I want everyone to know that I am not a victim. I agreed to this, knowing all the risks. And you know what? I won." The guests, who had been tense moments before, began exchanging glances. What did she mean by winning? Timothy stood frozen, unable to take his eyes off Natasha. He didn't understand what was happening, but something inside him broke. Timothy, she continued, turning back to him, you didn't expect that I would be stronger than you think. You thought you could outplay me by betting that I would be just a speck of dust in your path, but I decided to play this game by my own rules. And you know what? I'm thankful to you for this bet. Natasha looked at the guests before again addressing Timothy. You taught me to be stronger. You made me realize that I am capable of more than I thought. And I refuse to be a victim. On the contrary, I'm glad you got into this game, because now I know who I truly am. The room fell silent, awaiting the finale. What would happen next? Timothy could no longer control the situation. His hands trembled, and chaos ruled his mind. But here's what I'll tell you, Timothy, Natasha continued. Her voice softened, yet there was a note of determination in it that he had never heard before. I'm not going to marry you. You lost this game, and not just because I found out about the bet. You lost because you underestimated me as a woman. These words pierced him like a sharp arrow. All his plans, all schemes and tricks, crumbled in an instant. Goodbye, Timothy. Natasha gently set the microphone down and slowly turned to head for the exit. The guests in the hall couldn't believe their eyes. No one expected such a twist. Natasha, who seemed so naive and simple, had outplayed everyone in an instant. Timothy stood as if in a trance, unable to move. What now? How could he have allowed this to happen? The silence in the hall was deafening. The only sound was the fading steps of Natasha reminding him of reality. She didn't look back. Natasha left the hall, leaving behind shock and silence that seemed to seep into the walls. Timothy continued to stand at the altar, unable to budge. He heard the whispers of the guests, their disbelieving gazes mixed with curiosity and schadenfreude. They expected a loud finale, but no one could predict that the real loser would be him. Timothy felt as if everything inside him had emptied. The man who was used to controlling every situation had lost. His wager, his game, all of it had turned into a farce, and now everyone knew it. Years of successful deals, skilled manipulation, and high-stakes gambling couldn't save him from this moment. Victor, the very friend who had suggested the bet, finally approached him. His face shone with laughter, although in his eyes, Timothy could catch a hint of regret. Man, I didn't expect this ending, Victor said, patting him on the shoulder. She outplayed you. Honestly, I'm in shock. Timothy clenched his fists, his hands shaking, but he couldn't respond. Inside him, humiliation burned, but the strongest feeling tormenting him was the unexpected realization that he had indeed lost not just the bet. He had lost something much greater. Timothy, Victor continued, trying to lighten the mood, you know this was just a joke. She was smarter, that's all. Nothing tragic, soon everyone will forget about it. But Timothy couldn't forget. He understood that this situation would soon become headline news. Rich man loses a bet, sensational wedding of the year. The headlines were already forming in his mind. He abruptly turned and, without saying a word, left the hall. Outside, a warm autumn night awaited him. The stars twinkled in the black sky, but Timothy couldn't feel the beauty. He needed to get as far away from this place, these people, from the humiliating silence that continued to ring in his ears. The driver opened the door of the limousine for him, but Timothy, surprisingly for himself, waved him off. Leave me alone. He walked briskly down the street, leaving behind the bright lights and luxurious cars. Everything surrounding him felt unreal. He needed to think, to process what had happened and what to do next. But thoughts were tangled, and his heart beat too loudly to focus. Natasha was already far from that place, sitting in a small cafe on the city outskirts. She gazed at her reflection in the glass, trying to comprehend what she had done. Her heart was still racing. The adrenaline hadn't let go after such a bold act. But despite her fear and excitement, she felt a sense of lightness. When she learned about the bet, everything inside her turned upside down. She contemplated for a long time whether to leave immediately or confess to him that she knew everything. But the more she observed Timothy, the stronger her desire grew to take control into her own hands. She wanted to show that she wasn't a naive victim, that she was stronger than she appeared. And now, sitting in that quiet cafe, she knew she had succeeded. Natasha sipped her coffee, relishing the silence. The wedding she had looked forward to so eagerly had become her moment of triumph. And though she didn't have the wealth and status of Timothy, she had pride and a spirit that couldn't be bought. Timothy walked down the street, trying to drown out all the feelings that washed over him. He had never felt so vulnerable before. He wanted to turn back to the moment he agreed to that ridiculous wager. Why did he let himself get into this game so easily? And why hadn't he foreseen that it would end this way? At one point, he stopped, looking at his reflection in the window of a random shop. It was hard for him to admit it, but he realized it was not just about the bet. Natasha had changed him. In her eyes, in her courage, he saw something unexpected, real emotion, self-respect that he himself lacked. He hadn't lost a gamble, he'd lost love. That thought settled in his mind like a bitter sediment. Everything he had done before, all his wealth, status, nothing could replace what he had lost that evening. Natasha had left, possibly for good. But that feeling left an imprint on his soul that he could never erase. Now that the game was over, he was left alone with himself and the emptiness inside. Timothy couldn't move, continuing to stare at his reflection in the window. This was a completely different person compared to who he was a year ago. Back then, he was confident in himself, in his abilities, and charisma, but now all of that seemed hollow and meaningless. Passers-by hurried by him, paying no attention to the man in an expensive suit standing lost in the middle of the sidewalk. His mind raced between thoughts of the wager and what would come next. He suddenly realized that his life, filled with social receptions, elite deals, and luxury, was meaningless without the person who had been by his side all year. Natasha. Her name echoed in his mind. She turned out to be much stronger than he expected. She not only managed to turn the game on him, but also gave him the chance to see himself differently. Now Timothy understood that all this time he had been playing not just with her, but with himself. He had played the role of a wealthy, successful man, but inside, he remained empty. His mobile phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't answer. It was probably friends inviting him to another party or trying to console him after what had happened. But Timothy didn't want to hear their empty words anymore. For the first time in his life, he wanted to be alone and figure things out. He moved on, not knowing where he was headed. His footsteps echoed in the silence of the night city. Passing by luxurious restaurants and boutiques, he suddenly felt how foreign everything had become. It was as if this life no longer belonged to him. Meanwhile, Natasha had returned to her apartment. She took off her wedding dress, hung it on a hanger, and stared at it thoughtfully. This dress was supposed to symbolize her new beginning, but now it had become a reminder of the life she had left behind. She felt mixed emotions. On one hand, she was proud of herself for revealing the truth in front of everyone, but on the other hand, doubts still raged inside her. Was this the right decision? She loved Timothy, despite his game, despite the bet, but now, with the secret revealed, the path back seemed simply impossible. Natasha sat on the bed, covering her face with her hands and letting out a quiet sigh. Her plan was executed, yet a sense of emptiness still held her captive. She thought that after this bold act, it would feel easier, but did it? Perhaps she needed to talk to Timothy, to explain her feelings before staging such a public spectacle. But now it was too late. Suddenly, the phone on the nightstand rang, interrupting her thoughts. Natasha looked at the screen. It was her close friend, Pearl. "Hello," Natasha's voice was quiet and weary. "Natasha, are you okay?" Pearl's voice sounded worried. "I saw the news." "Everything's fine," Natasha sighed. She hadn't expected everything to hit the internet so quickly. Reporters and bloggers were already actively discussing her actions. And she understood that tomorrow this would become the main topic in the gossip columns. "I don't know, Pearl," she replied honestly. "Right now, it seems like I made the right choice, but..." You acted bravely, Natasha. Very bravely. But if you love him, maybe it's not all lost. Natasha fell silent. Her friend had always supported her, but now she didn't know how to respond to such words. Her love for Timothy was genuine, but could she ever bring everything back after such a turn of events? I'm not sure he can forgive me, Natasha said after a pause, and I'm not sure I want to go back to what it was. Pearl was silent for a few seconds, then cautiously asked, "Maybe you need time to think it over?" Sometimes we make hasty conclusions. I'm sure Timothy is confused too. He needs to realize that you're not just a game to him. Natasha understood that Pearl was right. Perhaps everything had happened too quickly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost something important, even though she had acted correctly. "Thank you, Pearl," Natasha replied with a smile. "I'll think about it." When she hung up the phone, her thoughts returned to Timothy. Where was he now? What was he feeling? She knew that his self-esteem had taken a significant blow. Timothy was used to always being the winner, but now he had found himself in the role of the loser for the first time. But would he be able to forgive her? Timothy was still wandering through the city when he found himself at the waterfront. The water in the river lapped gently against the shore, and the streetlights reflected on its surface. He stopped, sitting down on a bench. Here, away from the noise and lights, he could calm down a little. He recalled Natasha's face again, her confident words at the wedding. She was not at all who he thought she was. But was everything between them really over now? He had genuinely begun to develop feelings for her. Timothy understood that he should have confessed to her earlier, shared his feelings before everything turned into such a tragedy, but now it was too late. Or was it? A thought began to form inside him that perhaps not everything was lost. Maybe he could still win her back. To do that, he would have to set aside his pride and show that he had truly changed. Sitting on the bench, looking at the dark waters of the river, Timothy replayed the events of the past day in his mind. But after hours of reflection, he began to see everything differently. His pride, which had defined his life for so long, seemed less significant. Yes, he had tarnished his reputation, but did that really matter? He realized he had lost something much more valuable, Natasha, a woman who was with him not because of his money or status, but for deeper reasons. He had once viewed her merely as part of his plan, an object for winning a bet. But now that she was gone, he understood that her presence had filled a void in his life. And though he was used to being the winner, Timothy recognized that he had lost to himself. He pulled out his phone and opened her contact. His fingers paused momentarily over the screen. He wanted to type something simple yet sincere. Every word that came to mind felt either too cliché or inappropriate. Timothy wasn't used to saying sorry, especially to a woman who had outplayed him, but in that moment, he realized that more than anything else in the world, he wanted to win her back. He took a breath and began to write. "Natasha, I'm sorry. I know I made a mistake. I thought I was in control, but I was wrong. Everything was incorrect. I should have been honest with you from the beginning. You deserve better. Please give me a chance to explain and make things right. If you're willing, let's meet. I'm waiting for you at the waterfront, where we once walked at night. Timothy." After sending the message, he felt a wave of relief. Now it was just a matter of waiting. He didn't know if she would respond or show up, but deep down, he hoped that not everything was lost. Meanwhile, Natasha sat in her apartment, her gaze lost in space. The past few hours had passed in silence, but that silence was filled with thoughts and doubts. She replayed every word she had said at the wedding and every moment of her relationship with Timothy. Had it been a game for him? Certainly. But something inside her suggested that there was more beyond the game. Ever since she learned about the bet, her heart had been torn between hurt and hope. When her phone vibrated, Natasha looked at the screen. A message from Timothy. Her heart stopped, then beat rapidly. She hadn't expected him to reach out to her so quickly, and certainly not with such a heartfelt text. Reading the message, she clenched the phone in her hand, unsure how to respond. On one hand, she felt betrayed. Everything that had happened had been just a game. But on the other hand, she saw how Timothy had changed. His words sounded different than before. There was no arrogance in them, and perhaps this was his first step towards something real. She stood up from her bed and went to the window. Somewhere in this city, Timothy was waiting for her. Natasha closed her eyes, trying to listen to her heart. It was still beating for him. But was this a sensible decision? Her hands trembled. Inside her was a storm of contradictions, but despite that, she suddenly realized that she wanted to see him. Even if it was for the last time. She needed to hear his words in person. She had to understand if he had really changed. Putting on her coat, Natasha hurriedly left her apartment and headed to the waterfront. The night was cool, but not cold. The streets were empty, and her footsteps echoed in the silence. 1,000 thoughts swirled in her mind, but one stood out above the rest. What if he really had changed? Meanwhile, Timothy, sitting on the same bench, began to doubt she would come. The hours dragged painfully slowly, and his confidence gradually weakened. He was used to getting everything he wanted, but this situation was entirely different. Natasha wasn't a part of his business or another deal. She was real, and that frightened him the most. He couldn't control her, nor could he predict her reaction. He was about to get up and leave when he noticed a familiar figure in the distance. Natasha was walking along the waterfront, her silhouette standing out against the lamplight. Timothy stood up and took a few steps towards her. She stopped a few meters away, and their eyes met. Silence reigned between them, but it was not the same silence as at the wedding. This was a silence filled with anticipation and questions. "You came," Timothy said softly, feeling a strange warmth inside him. Natasha stood there, speechless. Her face remained calm, but her eyes betrayed a mixture of emotions, curiosity, hurt, and perhaps even hope. "I've thought a lot," she finally said. "Do you think one message can change everything?" Timothy sighed and shook his head. "No, I know it's not enough. I just wanted. I needed to explain. I was an idiot, and I know it. I played, but then everything changed. You changed me, Natasha." She continued to remain silent, but his words seemed to reach her. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the person you saw at the wedding." Natasha sighed and stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "Timothy, I need time. I can't just forget everything that happened. But I want to try to understand what's really going on." Timothy felt his heart begin to beat with renewed strength. This wasn't an answer, but it was a chance. A chance he hadn't dared to hope for.